You wait for them to look at you. You stand in the corner of a crowded ballroom, wearing the crown they forced on your head, and you watch your fated mates give the world the smiles that belong to you. People say being mated to the triplet kings is a fairy tale. They don't tell you the palace is just a gilded cage, and the princes are the ones locking the door. But what happens when the bird simply stops singing and flies away? Rowan stood by the grand pillars of the winter pavilion, nursing a glass of sparkling water that had gone flat 20 minutes ago. The ice was gone, just tepid water and a slice of bruised lemon. Across the room, the triplet kings held court. They were a force of nature, a terrifyingly perfect triad of alpha dominance that had brought the fractured Western territories to their knees. Asher, the eldest by 6 minutes, stood by the roaring hearth. His posture was rigid, dressed in immaculate midnight blue tailoring, speaking in low, commanding tones to the foreign ministers. Declan, the commander, leaned against the mahogany bar. He laughed loudly, a scarred hand clapping the shoulder of a high-ranking general, his raw, unpolished energy drawing a crowd like a gravitational pull. And then there was Caleb. Caleb was on the dance floor spinning a blushing, newly presented noble Omega, flashing that devastating media-trained smile that kept the tabloids fed and the public docile. Rowan watched them, his husbands, his alphas. He swallowed, his throat dry despite the water. The gold collar around his neck, a ceremonial piece meant to signify his status as the high consort, felt like a lead weight. It dug into his collarbone. The velvet of his tailored suit was too heavy for the overheated room. He didn't belong here. He hadn't belonged here for 3 years. When the mating bond had first snapped into place on their 21st birthday, the kingdom had rejoiced. A true fated mate for the triplet kings. A rare male Omega, quiet but resilient, plucked from a minor aristocratic family in the northern valleys. The press called it destiny. The council called it stability. Rowan had called it a beginning. He had been so hopelessly naive. More water, Your Grace? Rowan blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. A young server, barely out of his teens, stood beside him with a silver pitcher. The kid's eyes darted nervously to the kings across the room, then back to Rowan, softening with something that looked entirely too much like pity. "No thank you, Thomas," Rowan said. His voice was quiet, lacking the melodic, demanding lilt usually associated with pampered Omegas. "I think I'm going to turn in." "Shall I inform His Majesties?" Rowan looked at Asher, who was now aggressively negotiating a trade route, his jaw set in stone. He looked at Declan, who was pouring a line of whiskey shots for his lieutenants. He looked at Caleb, whose hand was lingering just a fraction too long on the waist of his dance partner. "Don't bother them," Rowan said softly. "They're working." He set the glass on a passing tray and turned his back on the room. No one called out to him, no head turned. The heavy oak doors of the pavilion closed behind him with a dull thud, cutting off the music and the laughter. The walk to his chambers took 10 minutes. The palace was a sprawling ancient beast of stone and glass, full of drafty corridors and portraits of dead monarchs who stared down at him with painted judgment. Rowan's footsteps echoed. The silence was absolute. He entered his suite. His suite, not theirs. In the first year they had tried. There had been a massive, sprawling bed in the royal wing meant for all 4 of them, but Asher was a chronic insomniac who needed the lights on to read legislation. Declan ran on 3 hours of sleep and woke up swinging, traumatized by the border wars. Caleb rarely came to bed at all, preferring the company of the city's neon-lit clubs. Slowly, quietly, Rowan had moved his things into the East Wing, a guest room initially, just for a few nights to catch up on sleep. They had never asked him to come back. Rowan unfastened the gold collar. He dropped it on the vanity. It landed with a hollow clatter. He looked at himself in the mirror. He was 25, but he looked older. The light in his hazel eyes had dimmed. His cheekbones were sharper. The mating marks on his neck, 3 overlapping bites, 1 from each alpha, meant to be flushed and dark with active bonding, were pale, faded. They looked like old scars. He touched them with trembling fingers. A fated mate needed their alpha's pheromones to thrive. It wasn't just romance. It was biology. Without their scent, without their touch, an Omega's body began to turn on itself, a slow, creeping lethargy, a permanent, bone-deep ache. Rowan didn't cry. He hadn't cried in a year. The tears had dried up right around the time he realized that they didn't hate him. Hate would have been a fire. Hate would have been something he could fight. They didn't hate him. They were just indifferent. They had conquered their kingdom, secured their crown, and claimed their fated mate. The checklist was complete. The trophy was on the shelf. You don't play with a trophy once you've won it. You just occasionally polish it for the cameras. Rowan stripped off the heavy velvet suit, pulled on an old, oversized gray sweater that smelled only of his own faint, bitter cedarwood scent, and crawled into the cold, empty bed. He didn't wait up. The breaking point didn't come with shattered glass or screaming matches. It came on a Tuesday, amidst the smell of burnt sugar and the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock. It was their 4th anniversary. Rowan had spent 3 days preparing. He knew how busy they were. He wasn't stupid, and he wasn't blind to the realities of ruling a nation. There were insurgencies in the south, an economic crisis in the east. He didn't expect grand romantic gestures or weeks away in a summer palace. He just wanted a dinner. 2 hours. Just the 4 of them in the private dining room with no ministers, no generals, and no sycophants. He had sent the invitations to their private secretaries a month in advance. He had received 3 identical polite confirmations. At 7 o'clock, Rowan was dressed in a simple but elegant black shirt, sitting at the head of the small, intimate table. The kitchen staff had prepared Asher's favorite venison, Declan's preferred spiced potatoes, and the delicate pear tart Caleb loved. At 8 o'clock, the food was kept warm under silver cloches. Rowan read a book. At 9 o'clock, the head chef came out, wiping his hands on his apron. "Your Grace," he murmured, his eyes on the floor. "The meat will dry out soon." "Give them a little longer, chef," Rowan said, not looking up from his page. "Traffic in the upper wards can be terrible." It was a lie. Kings didn't sit in traffic. At 10:30, the grandfather clock in the corner chimed the half-hour. The sound echoed in the empty room. Rowan closed his book. He stood up. His joints popped. The biological ache of his neglected Omega nature flared up, a sharp pain in his lower back. "Clear the table," Rowan told the waiting staff. The maids and footmen moved in silence. They didn't look at him. That was the worst part. The staff knew. The whole palace knew. They saw the way the kings walked past Rowan in the halls without stopping. They saw the way Asher looked through him, the way Declan grunted in response to his questions, the way Caleb offered him the same charming, empty smile he gave to the press before vanishing into the night. Rowan walked down the corridor to the war room. If they were working, he would bring the food to them. He would be the dutiful mate. He would swallow his pride. He reached the heavy oak doors of the Central Command Center. 2 guards stood at attention. They didn't stop him as he pushed the doors open. The room was brightly lit, smelling of stale coffee and cigar smoke. Declan was leaning over a massive map, surrounded by 3 generals. He looked exhausted, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hair disheveled. Asher sat at the head of the long table, a phone pressed to his ear, rubbing his temples. Caleb wasn't there. Rowan stood in the doorway. He waited for one of them to look up. He waited for the instinctual snap of the alpha recognizing their mate. Nothing. "We flanked them here," Declan growled, tapping a red marker on the map. "We don't wait for the UN peacekeepers. We take the ridge by dawn." "The optics on that are terrible, Dec." Asher snapped into the phone, holding his hand over the receiver. "Give me 24 hours to grease the Foreign Office." Rowan took a step into the room. Asher. Declan. Declan didn't even look up. "Not now, Rowan. Can't you see we're in the middle of a crisis?" "It's 10:45, Rowan said. His voice was incredibly calm, eerily calm. "And the insurgents don't carry watches," Declan barked, finally snapping his head up. His eyes, a striking, violent green, flashed with alpha annoyance. "Go to bed. You're hovering. Rowan looked at Asher. Asher had finished his call and was already dialing another number. Asher, Rowan said. Rowan, please. Asher sighed, exasperated. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. I have the Prime Minister of the Coalition on hold. Go find Caleb if you're bored, or buy something. Whatever you want. Just close the door behind you. Buy something. Rowan stood there for 3 long seconds. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a coldness, like a heavy iron vault slamming shut and locking tight. The desperate, frantic inner voice of his Omega, the one that had spent 3 years crying out for attention, for warmth, for a single scrap of affection, suddenly went entirely silent. It didn't hurt anymore. The realization was anesthetic. They didn't care. They never would. Rowan didn't argue. He didn't scream. He didn't throw a tantrum and demand they remember what day it was. He just looked at the 2 men who held his soul in their hands, and he saw strangers. Good night, Rowan said quietly. He stepped back and let the heavy doors pull shut. The click of the latch echoed in the hallway. He walked back to his empty suite. Caleb never came home that night. The next morning, a tabloid published a blurry photo of the youngest king leaving a high-end club in the city, an unnamed model draped over his arm. Rowan sat at his small kitchen table, drinking black coffee, looking at the newspaper. He didn't feel anger. He just felt done. He didn't pack much. When you leave a life behind, you realize how little of it actually belonged to you. The tailored suits, the diamond cufflinks, the ceremonial daggers. They belonged to the crown. They belonged to the role of the consort. Rowan packed 1 canvas duffel bag. He packed 2 pairs of jeans, a few plain t-shirts, and the thick hand-knit wool sweaters he had brought with him from the north 3 years ago. He packed his own toothbrush. He left the platinum one on the sink. He stood in the center of the bedroom, looking at the space. It looked exactly like a hotel room. There was no imprint of him here, no shared photos, no messy accumulation of a life lived together. He walked over to the vanity and opened the top drawer. Inside sat a thick stack of heavy cream-colored stationery, stamped with the royal crest. He picked up a pen. He stared at the blank page for 5 minutes. What could he say? You neglected me? They knew. I'm lonely? They didn't care. I'm leaving? That would be obvious soon enough. He put the pen down. He didn't write a single word. There would be no dramatic letter, no tear-stained goodbye. They hadn't given him their time. He wouldn't give them his words. He checked the train schedule on his phone. The Northern Express left at 6 a.m. It was currently 5:15 a.m. Rowan slung the bag over his shoulder. He left his encrypted royal phone on the mattress. He kept his old battered pre-palace phone that barely held a charge. He walked out of the room and left the door wide open. The palace was dead quiet at this hour. The night shift was finishing up, their eyes heavy. The morning shift hadn't fully clocked in. Rowan walked down the grand staircase. He didn't sneak. He didn't hide in the shadows. He walked right down the center of the crimson carpet, his boots making soft thuds against the fabric. He passed a pair of royal guards at the front entrance. "Morning, Your Grace," one of them mumbled, snapping a half-hearted salute, assuming the consort was simply going for an early walk in the gardens. He was so used to Rowan being a non-issue, a quiet ghost haunting the halls, that the duffel bag didn't even register as a red flag. "Good morning, Miller," Rowan said softly. He walked out the front doors. The morning air was sharp and biting. It smelled of rain and pavement. Rowan took a deep breath. For the first time in 3 years, his lungs expanded fully. The oppressive, heavy scent of cedar, smoke, and expensive cologne that permeated the palace was gone. He walked through the outer gates. He flagged down a passing city cab. "Central Station," Rowan told the driver, tossing his bag into the back and sliding in. The city blurred past the window. The neon signs flickered out as dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. Rowan leaned his head against the cold glass. He touched his neck. The faded mating marks gave a faint, phantom throb. Distance was dangerous for a modded Omega. Moving hundreds of miles away from an alpha bond could cause physical illness, fever, and severe depression. But Rowan figured he had already been living through that in the very same house as them. He had built up an immunity to the pain of their absence. He bought a ticket with cash, a one-way coach seat to the furthest northern terminus. At 5:55 a.m., he boarded the train. At 6 a.m., the train lurched forward, pulling out of the station, leaving the capital city behind in a cloud of steam and screeching metal. Rowan closed his eyes. The rhythmic clack of the tracks was a lullaby. Back in the palace, at 8 a.m., Asher sat at the grand dining table reading the morning briefs. Declan was aggressively cutting into a steak. Caleb strolled in, wearing sunglasses indoors, smelling faintly of alcohol and regret, and slumped into a chair. "Late night?" Asher asked dryly, not looking up from his tablet. "Long night," Caleb corrected, rubbing his temples. "Could someone please get me an aspirin?" A maid scurried forward, pouring water. Asher tapped his tablet. "Where's Rowan? I need him to sign off on the charity gala guest list by noon." "Sleeping in, probably," Declan grunted. "I told him off last night in the war room. He was hovering again." "He means well, Dec," Caleb yawned. "Just needy." "Someone go get him," Asher commanded the room at large. A senior footman bowed and hurried off toward the east wing. 10 minutes passed. The kings ate in silence, the only sound the clinking of silver against porcelain. Then the footman returned. He was pale. His hands were shaking. He stopped at the edge of the dining room, bowing so deeply he nearly folded in half. "Well?" Asher snapped. "Is he coming?" "Your Majesties," the footman stammered. "The consort. His Grace is not in his chambers." "So he's in the garden," Declan sighed impatiently. "Search the grounds." "Sire," the footman swallowed hard. "His closet is empty of his personal items. His royal phone is on the bed. The door was left open. The guards at the gate report he left on foot 2 hours ago with a travel bag." The dining room went dead silent. Asher's tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the wood table. Declan's knife froze in midair. Caleb slowly pulled his sunglasses down, his bloodshot eyes widening. Suddenly, simultaneously, all three kings gasped, a sharp, violent intake of air. Deep in their chests, a physical tether, a thick, heavy cord of primal magic that connected an alpha to their mate, yanked tight, stretched to its absolute limit, and then went horrifyingly, sickeningly slack. The ghost had left the house, and for the first time in 3 years, the alphas felt the cold. The silence in the dining room was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. For 3 years, the mating bond had been a quiet hum in the background of the kings' minds. A dull, static frequency they had learned to tune out. They hadn't noticed it because it was always there, a steady baseline of unconditional devotion radiating from the east wing. Now there was only static. Then a sharp, ringing void. Declan was the first to move. The heavy mahogany chair splintered as he kicked it backward, his massive frame launching up. His chest heaved. The alpha inside him, usually disciplined and chained by military protocol, slammed against his ribs, howling at the sudden amputation of their pack. "Search the grounds!" Declan roared, his voice rattling the crystal chandelier overhead. "Every room, every closet, every goddamn inch of the perimeter. Lock down the gates. Ground all flights out of the capital." "Declan, stop!" Asher commanded, though his voice lacked its usual steel. Asher's hands were flat on the table, bracing his weight. His knuckles were bone white. The geopolitical maps, the trade agreements, the coalition treaties, they all evaporated from his mind, replaced by a sudden, terrifying vertigo. He looked at the footman, who was trembling violently by the door. "You said his closet is empty," Asher said, his words precise and clipped. "Yes, sire. Only his state garments remain." Caleb didn't speak. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. His sunglasses fell to the carpet. The charming, effortless aura that usually surrounded him was gone, replaced by a pale, sickly pallor. He turned and walked out of the room. He didn't run. He walked like a man in a trance. Asher and Declan followed. They bypassed the grand staircase, taking the servant corridors, moving with a predatory speed that had the palace staff pressing themselves flat against the walls in terror. They reached the east wing. Rowan's door was wide open. Caleb was already inside. He was standing in the center of the bedroom, staring. Asher stopped in the doorway, Declan crowding in behind him. They looked at the room, really looked at it, and for the first time they realized they were standing in a stranger's space. It didn't look like the chambers of a royal consort. There were no lavish tapestries, no expensive art. The walls were bare. The bed was made perfectly, not a wrinkle in the duvet. On the vanity, sitting directly in the center, was the heavy gold collar. Declan stalked past Asher, heading straight for the massive walk-in closet. He tore the doors open. Rowan's official wardrobe was perfectly organized. Velvet suits, silk shirts, tailored trousers, all the armor the crown had bought him. But the back shelves, the ones meant for comfortable everyday wear, were completely bare. Declan walked into the bathroom. He saw the platinum toothbrush sitting in its holder. He saw the untouched bottles of expensive colognes they had gifted Rowan for his birthdays, still wrapped in cellophane. "He took nothing," Declan said. His voice was gravelly, the panic beginning to bleed into a raw, ugly anger. "He took nothing of ours." Caleb walked over to the bed. He collapsed onto his knees. He grabbed a handful of the white sheets and buried his face in them, pulling in a deep, desperate breath, searching for the soothing scent of cedar and rain that belonged to their mate. Caleb pulled back, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "It's stale," he whispered. "He hasn't slept in this bed in days, maybe weeks. It just smells like bleach." Asher walked to the vanity. He stared at the gold collar. He picked it up. It was heavy, cold. He ran his thumb over the clasp. He turned toward the nightstand, looking for a note, a demand, an ultimatum, something he could negotiate with. There was nothing, just Rowan's official palace phone, sitting dead on the glass surface. "He didn't leave a letter," Asher said softly. The reality of it was worse than anger. It was indifference. Rowan hadn't cared enough to yell at them. He hadn't cared enough to explain. "Get the head of security," Declan barked over his shoulder to a terrified guard hovering in the hall. "I want the camera feeds. Now." 10 minutes later, the three kings stood in the subterranean security hub. The monitors cast a harsh blue light over their faces. On the screen, time stamped at 5:12 a.m., they watched Rowan. He was wearing a faded gray sweater. He had a single canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He walked down the grand staircase. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. They watched him pass the front gates. They watched Guard Miller give him a lazy salute. They watched Rowan nod, flag down a yellow city cab, and vanish into the morning mist. "He just walked out," Caleb choked out, staring at the frozen frame of the cab's taillights. "He just left." "Trace the cab," Asher ordered the technician. "Find out where he went. Pull his financial records. See if he bought a plane ticket." "Sire." The technician swallowed hard, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "His Grace. He hasn't touched his royal stipend in 3 years. The account is completely full." Asher froze. "What about his personal account, the one from before?" "It has exactly $600 in it, sire. Withdrawn from an ATM at Central Station at 5:45 a.m. Central Station, a hub with hundreds of trains departing in every direction, carrying thousands of untraceable cash-paying passengers. Declan slammed his fist into the steel desk. The metal dented. The monitor flickered. "He is our mate," he roared, his chest heaving, his fangs dropping. "He cannot survive without us. The bond will kill him. We have to find him." Asher looked at the dented desk. He looked at Caleb, who was shaking, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. He looked at the screen where Rowan was walking away from them. "He cannot survive without us," Declan had said. But as Asher stared at the screen, watching the calm, steady pace of Rowan's footsteps, a cold, sickening realization settled in his gut. Rowan had been surviving without them for 3 years, right under their roof. The town of Oakhaven was not on any tourist map. It was a bleak, freezing logging town nestled in the jagged teeth of the northern mountains. It smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and wet earth. Rowan stepped off the train. The wind hit him like a physical blow, cutting right through his thin sweater. It was 10 degrees below zero. He took a deep breath. The icy air burned his lungs. It felt incredible. He walked down the main street. The snow was packed hard on the sidewalks. A few locals in heavy parkas gave him passing glances, but nobody stopped him. Up here, he wasn't his grace. He wasn't the consort. He was just another face looking for shelter against the wind. He pushed open the heavy oak door of a small, dimly lit diner. A bell jingled above his head. The smell of frying bacon and bitter coffee wrapped around him. Behind the counter, wiping down the laminate surface with a rag, was a broad-shouldered beta with a thick beard and tired eyes. He looked up at the sound of the bell. Elias froze. The rag slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a wet slap. "Rowan?" Elias breathed, his voice thick with disbelief. "Hey, Eli," Rowan said quietly. He offered a small, exhausted smile. "You still making that terrible chicory coffee?" Elias vaulted over the counter. He crossed the diner in 3 massive strides and pulled Rowan into a bone-crushing hug. Rowan closed his eyes, leaning into the warmth of his oldest friend. Elias smelled like motor oil and burnt toast. It was the best thing he had smelled in years. "What are you doing here?" Elias asked, pulling back, holding Rowan by the shoulders. He scanned Rowan's face, his smile fading into a deep frown. He saw the sharp cheekbones, the hollow eyes, the pale, faded mating marks peeking out from the collar of his sweater. "Gods, Ro, you look like hell." "I left," Rowan said simply. Elias didn't ask questions. He didn't ask about the kings, or the politics, or the scandal that was undoubtedly about to erupt. He just picked up Rowan's single duffel bag. "My apartment is above the diner," Elias said. "You take the bed. I'll take the couch." That night the bond sickness hit. It was inevitable. You cannot sever a physical biological tether without bleeding. When you pull hundreds of miles away from an alpha bond, the Omega's body goes into severe withdrawal. Rowan lay in Elias's small, lumpy bed, shaking violently. His skin burned with a fever of 103. His joints felt like they were packed with crushed glass. Every instinct in his genetic code was screaming at him to run back, to submit, to find the alphas, and beg for their scent. Elias sat by the bed, pressing cold, wet towels to Rowan's forehead. "I can call a doctor, Ro," Elias whispered, watching Rowan grit his teeth as a spasm wrecked his body. "They have suppressants. They can numb it." "No," Rowan gasped, his fingers twisting into the cheap polyester sheets. "No suppressants. Let it burn." He wanted it to hurt. He wanted the venom out of his system. The pain was a crucible. Every hour he endured the agony was an hour he claimed back his own body. He wasn't going to numb it. He was going to walk through the fire until he came out the other side entirely his own. It took 5 days. For 5 days, Rowan lived in a haze of fever and phantom pain. He dreamed of the pavilion. He dreamed of Asher's voice, Declan's hands, Caleb's laugh. And then he dreamed of empty chairs, cold food, and closed doors. On the morning of the 6th day, the fever broke. Rowan opened his eyes. The room was freezing. Frost painted the edges of the window pane. He sat up. His muscles were weak, his body exhausted, but the frantic, desperate screaming in his blood was gone. The tether hadn't snapped completely. He knew that. They were still legally, biologically bound. But the cord had gone numb. The emotional dependency had burned out, leaving only a dull physical scar. Rowan threw off the covers. He walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered mountains. He didn't feel like a ghost anymore. Over the next 3 weeks, Rowan built a life. A real, tangible life. He traded his designer shoes for heavy, steel-toed boots. He bought thick, rough wool flannels that scratched his skin and kept the biting cold out. He worked in Elias's diner, clearing tables, washing dishes, slicing potatoes. His hands, once manicured and soft, developed calluses. His skin, previously pale from the sunless palace corridors, caught the harsh mountain wind and flushed with color. He ate heavy stews and thick bread. He gained 5 pounds. One Tuesday afternoon, a customer, a gruff logger who came in every day at noon, told a terrible, inappropriate joke about a bear and a chainsaw. Rowan dropped a stack of plates into the wash bin and burst out laughing. It wasn't a polite, measured chuckle. It was a loud, rough, genuine sound that echoed through the small diner. Elias, who was flipping burgers on the grill, froze. He looked back at Rowan, his eyes widening. "What?" Rowan asked, wiping a tear from his eye, still grinning. "Nothing," Elias said softly, turning back to the grill, a tight smile pulling at his bearded face. "Just haven't heard that sound since we were kids." Rowan looked down at the soapy water. He realized Elias was right. He had survived the Kings. He was finally breathing. But down in the capital, the men he left behind were suffocating. 3 weeks. In the grand scheme of a nation's history, 3 weeks is nothing. In the palace, it was enough time for everything to burn to the ground. The public didn't know yet. The press office had spun a frantic web of lies. The consort is on a private spiritual retreat. The consort is visiting foreign diplomats. But the cracks were showing. The triplet kings were unraveling. Without their mate's stabilizing presence, the alpha biology turned volatile. The aggression they usually channeled into their work began to bleed out, raw and unpolished. Declan had nearly beaten a foreign ambassador to death over a minor trade dispute. It took 6 royal guards to pull him off, leaving the war room covered in shattered glass and blood. He stopped sleeping entirely. He paced the halls at night, his eyes glowing a feral, unnatural green, tearing through the east wing, roaring at the staff if they moved a single item in Rowan's empty room. Asher's meticulous, logical mind was fracturing. He was making reckless, paranoid political decisions. He fired his entire cabinet in a single morning because one of them suggested Rowan might not come back. He sat at his desk for days, ignoring the ringing phones, staring at the financial report that showed Rowan's bank account. $600. He had left with nothing. It haunted Asher. He couldn't buy his way out of this. He couldn't legislate Rowan's return. And Caleb. Caleb was a ghost. The charming, media-darling king hadn't been seen in public for 21 days. He had locked himself in the royal wine cellar. He was entirely sober. He just sat in the dark, clutching the heavy velvet suit Rowan had worn on the night he left, pressing it to his face until he couldn't breathe, desperately clinging to the fading scent of cedar. They were dying of thirst, and they had only realized it after they smashed the glass. On the 22nd day, the door to the war room burst open. The head of Royal Intelligence stepped in, holding a single manila folder. He looked terrified. Asher snapped his head up from his desk. Declan stopped pacing, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Caleb, who had been dragged out of the cellar an hour prior, sat in the corner, hollow-eyed. "We found him," the intelligence officer said. 3 chairs scraped violently against the floor. "Where?" Asher demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating whip. "A town called Oakhaven, far north, near the border." The officer swallowed. He isn't hiding, sires. He used his real name to sign a lease on a small apartment above a diner." "Get the jet ready," Declan snarled, already moving toward the door. "Call the guard. I want a 60-man security detail. I want the roads closed." "No." Asher's voice stopped Declan in his tracks. Asher stood up. His suit was wrinkled. He looked 10 years older. "No guards," Asher said quietly. "No royal entourage. No press. We do not storm his home with an army. That is what kings do." "We are kings!" Declan roared. "Not to him," Caleb whispered from the corner. His voice was cracked, unused. He looked up, his eyes glassy. "We were never his kings. We were just his husbands. And we failed." They left within the hour. They took an unmarked matte black SUV. Declan drove. He pushed the armored vehicle to its absolute limits, tearing up the winding, icy mountain roads, running red lights, ignoring the treacherous cliff edges. The journey took 14 hours. 14 hours of suffocating, tense silence. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the physical toll of the bond distance, which had been dulling their senses for weeks, suddenly spiked, then vanished. As they crossed the town line of Oakhaven, the tether in their chests snapped taut. They felt him. The sensation was so overwhelming that Declan slammed on the brakes. The heavy SUV skidded on the black ice, fishtailing wildly before slamming into a snowbank. None of them cared. They threw open the doors and stepped out into the freezing wind. They stood in the center of the main street. They were dressed in tailored wool coats, looking completely out of place amidst the rundown storefronts and heavy snowdrifts. Their alpha instincts flared, pulling them like a compass needle toward a small, dingy diner at the end of the block. "He's in there," Declan breathed, his fangs extending, his pupils blowing wide. "I smell him." They walked toward the diner. Their hearts were pounding against their ribs like war drums. They expected him to be sick. They expected him to be pale, bedridden, broken by the separation. They fully expected to walk in, scoop him up into their arms, and take him home. They expected him to cry in relief. Asher pushed the heavy oak door open. The little bell jingled. The diner was mostly empty. The smell of frying grease hit them, and there he was. Rowan was standing behind the counter. He was wearing a faded red flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He had an apron tied around his waist, smeared with flour. He was laughing at something the bearded beta beside him was saying. He didn't look broken. He looked radiant. The hollows in his cheeks were gone. His skin was flushed and healthy. The posture that had always been stiff and submissive in the palace was relaxed, confident. The little bells stopped jingling. Rowan turned his head. His eyes locked onto the three imposing figures standing in the doorway. The laughter died on his lips. The bustling noise of the kitchen seemed to evaporate. Asher took a step forward, his chest tight with a desperation he had never known. "Rowan!" he choked out, the name tearing from his throat. Declan's hands shook. Caleb let out a broken, pathetic noise. They waited for the bond to pull him to them. They waited for his Omega instincts to override him, to force him across the room and into their arms. Rowan stood perfectly still. He looked at Asher. He looked at Declan. He looked at Caleb. He didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. He looked at them the exact same way they had looked at him for 3 years, with complete, unwavering indifference. Rowan slowly picked up a rag from the counter, wiped his hands, and looked at the beta beside him. "Elias," Rowan said, his voice calm, clear, and perfectly steady. "Tell these men the diner is closed." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a guillotine blade. Tell these men the diner is closed. Declan's vision went red. The primal, territorial rage of a challenged alpha overrode 3 years of military discipline. He didn't see Elias as a man. He saw him as an obstacle between himself and what belonged to him. A low, guttural snarl vibrated in Declan's chest, a sound that made the few remaining patrons in the diner freeze in absolute terror. He lunged forward, his heavy boots shaking the floorboards. Elias didn't flinch. He reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy iron tire iron, slamming it onto the laminate surface with a deafening crack. "Step back, buddy," Elias warned, his voice a steady, rumbling baritone. He wasn't an alpha, but he was built like a freight train, and he wasn't backing down. "Elias, don't," Rowan said. Rowan didn't cower behind his friend. He stepped out from behind the counter, putting his body directly in Declan's path. He stood a full head shorter than the alpha, dressed in flour and flannel, possessing zero physical leverage. Declan stopped inches from Rowan. His chest heaved. His green eyes were completely dilated, swallowed by the black of his pupils. The scent of distress, dominance, and panicked possessiveness poured off him, thick enough to choke on. "Get your things," Declan commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the alpha voice, a biological weapon, a frequency designed to force an Omega's nervous system into immediate, unquestioning submission. Usually, when an alpha used that tone, an Omega's knees buckled, their head bowed. The fight vanished. Rowan just looked up at him. His knees didn't buckle. His pulse didn't flutter. He felt a faint pressure in his ears, like an airplane descending too quickly, but the primal command simply slid off him. "Your voice doesn't work on me anymore, Declan," Rowan said. His tone was conversational, mild even. "You starved the bond. It's dead tissue. You can't flex a dead muscle." Declan reeled back as if he had been slapped. The color drained from his face, leaving his battle-scarred skin a sickly, ashen gray. He looked at Rowan's neck. The mating marks, his own bite mark, were pale white, faded, dead. Asher stepped in, gripping Declan by the shoulder and pulling him back with a vicious yank. Asher was trembling, but his mind was scrambling to regain control, to negotiate, to find the lever he could pull to fix this. "Rowan," Asher said, his voice dropping into the smooth, diplomatic cadence he used to soothe hostile nations. "We have handled this terribly. We were careless. We admit that. But you are our mate. You belong in the capital. Whatever you want. New chambers, a different title, a place on the council. It's yours. Just come home." Rowan tilted his head. He looked at Asher like he was observing a confusing, mildly annoying puzzle. "Asher," Rowan sighed, wiping flour off his hands onto his apron. "You still think this is a transaction? You think you can throw a different crown at my feet and I'll pick it up? I don't want a place on your council. I don't want your chambers." He gestured around the greasy-smelling diner. "I have a job. I have a life. I am home." "This isn't a life," Asher snapped, his composure cracking, gesturing wildly at the stained walls. "You are the high consort. You are serving cheap coffee to lumberjacks." "And they say thank you," Rowan replied instantly. The words cracked like a whip. "They look me in the eye, and they say thank you, which is more than you managed in 3 years." Asher's mouth clicked shut. The absolute certainty in Rowan's eyes tore through the king's armor. There was no negotiation here. There were no terms. From the corner by the door, a ragged sob broke the silence. Caleb was leaning against the doorframe, his hands covering his face. The youngest king, the media darling who had never let the world see him sweat, was falling apart in a roadside diner. "Rowan, please," Caleb choked out, dropping his hands. His eyes were red, swollen, the dark circles beneath them bruised and purple. "Please, I can't sleep. My skin hurts. I can't breathe without you. We're dying." Rowan looked at Caleb. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of something crossed his face. Pity. But it was quickly snuffed out by a cold, hard resolve forged in 3 years of identical agony. "I know exactly how it feels," Rowan said softly. "I felt it every night while you were out at the clubs. I survived it. You will too." He turned his back on them. He walked over to the wash bin and plunged his hands into the soapy water. "Elias," Rowan called over his shoulder, not looking back. "If they aren't ordering anything, ask them to leave." The 3 most powerful men in the Western Hemisphere stood frozen. They had armies at their beck and call. They had wealth that could buy small countries. They had the divine mandate of the Alpha Triad, and they had just been dismissed by a dishwasher. Declan looked like he was going to tear the walls down. Asher's hands were shaking so hard his knuckles popped. But they knew, with absolute terrifying clarity, that if they dragged Rowan out of this diner by force, he would shatter completely. They would be taking a corpse back to the palace. Asher grabbed Declan's collar. He grabbed Caleb's arm. "We're leaving," Asher rasped. They backed out of the diner. The bell jingled merrily as the heavy door swung shut behind them. They didn't go back to the capital. The idea of returning to that echoing empty palace made all three of them physically ill. Instead, Asher walked across the snow-packed street to the only lodging in Oakhaven, the Pines Motel. It was a cinder-block structure with a flickering neon sign and a parking lot full of potholes. Asher walked into the cramped lobby, dropped a solid gold royal insignia ring on the linoleum counter, and told the terrified teenager behind the desk that they were renting the entire property indefinitely. For the first time in their lives, the Kings were stripped of their machinery. There were no press secretaries to spin the narrative. There were no guards to enforce their will. There were no chefs, no valets, no maids. There was only a stained carpet, a radiator that clanked loudly in the night, and the suffocating reality of what they had done. The first 3 days were a bloodbath of withdrawal. Without the distraction of running a country, the physical separation from their mate, even though he was only 100 yards away, tore into them. Declan punched a hole through the drywall of room 12. Caleb vomited pure bile into a rust-stained toilet, his body rejecting food in its state of biological panic. Asher sat in the center of the sagging mattress, staring at the ceiling, shivering under a thin, scratchy blanket. They had to face the monster they had created. The monster was their own neglect. On the 4th day, they started going to the diner. They didn't cause a scene. They didn't demand an audience. They simply walked in at 6 a.m., sat in the furthest booth in the corner, and ordered black coffee. Rowan didn't serve them. Elias brought the mugs, slamming them down on the table without a word. The Kings sat there for hours. They watched Rowan. They watched him wipe tables, laugh with the regulars, carry heavy trays of dishes. They watched him live a life completely devoid of them. It was a grueling, agonizing punishment. Every smile Rowan gave to a stranger was a knife twisting in their ribs. By the 2nd week, the town of Oakhaven had adjusted to the bizarre reality of the Triplet Kings occupying the corner booth of their local diner. The loggers and mechanics stopped staring. They realized these men weren't here to rule. They were here to beg. On a freezing Tuesday evening, Rowan was taking out the trash. He pushed through the heavy metal back door of the kitchen, carrying 2 bulging garbage bags. The alley was dark, illuminated only by a single yellow bulb. The snow was falling thick and heavy. He threw the bags into the dumpster. When he turned around, Caleb was standing there. Caleb wasn't wearing his designer overcoat. He was wearing a cheap synthetic jacket he had bought from the local hardware store because he had ruined his own clothes in the snow. He looked hollowed out. The arrogant, charming playboy was entirely gone. "I'm not going back in there," Rowan said immediately, his voice flat. He crossed his arms over his chest to ward off the cold. "I know," Caleb said. His voice was a rasp. He kept his distance, pressing his back against the brick wall, keeping his head down. "I'm not asking you to." Rowan frowned. He didn't move. "I was a coward," Caleb said to the snow-covered pavement. "I hated the palace. I hated the pressure. So I ran. I went to the clubs. I drank. I pretended I wasn't a king, but I made you pay the price for my escape. I left you in that mausoleum alone." Caleb finally looked up. Snow collected in his dark hair. "I'm sorry," Caleb whispered. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a negotiation. It was raw, bleeding truth. "I know it doesn't fix it. I know an apology doesn't erase 3 years of empty rooms, but I needed to say it." Rowan stared at him. He saw the shivering. He saw the genuine, absolute remorse in the alpha's eyes. A tiny, microscopic fraction of the ice around Rowan's heart cracked. Just a hairline fracture. "It doesn't fix it," Rowan agreed quietly. "I know." Caleb nodded, swallowing hard. He pushed off the wall. "Have a good night, Rowan." Caleb walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow. Rowan stood by the dumpster for a long time, the freezing wind biting his cheeks before turning back inside. The next afternoon, Declan found a way to bridge the gap. The diner ran on a massive wood-fired stove for the winter, requiring constant fuel. Elias usually spent his afternoons out back, splitting logs. Declan walked around to the alley. He didn't say a word. He just took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, took the heavy iron maul from Elias's hands, and started chopping. Elias stood there, bewildered, watching the commander of the Western armies demolish a cord of wood with terrifying, rhythmic efficiency. Declan chopped for 3 hours. The physical labor burned off the frantic alpha anxiety that was eating him alive. He didn't ask to see Rowan. He didn't ask for a thank you. When he was done, he stacked the wood perfectly, put his jacket back on, and walked back to the motel. He did it again the next day. And the next. Asher took a different approach. He was a man of paper and ink, a man of laws. He realized that the foundation of their mating was built on a legal requirement, not a partnership. One evening, before the diner closed, Asher walked up to the counter. He didn't order coffee. He slid a thick manila envelope across the laminate. Rowan looked down at it. "What is this?" "Divestment," Asher said. He looked exhausted, the bags under his eyes deep and dark. "Legal documents. It strips the title of High Consort from your name. It removes you from the royal lineage. It untethers your finances from the crown." Rowan froze. His breath hitched. He looked at Asher, searching the Alpha's face for a trick. "You're divorcing me?" "No," Asher said firmly. "I am unchaining you. You are still our mate. We are still bound by biology and by my own soul, whether you want us or not. But you are no longer property of the state. You are a free citizen. You owe the crown nothing." Asher tapped the envelope. "You don't have to sign them, but they are yours. If you want to burn this bridge entirely, the match is in your hand." Asher turned and walked out, leaving the envelope on the counter. Rowan stood in the empty diner, staring at the paper. For the first time since he had left the palace, he felt a tear prick the corner of his eye. It was the first time Asher had ever given him something that wasn't a cage. Winter bled into early spring, the snow melted into gray slush, and the biting wind of Oakhaven softened. The kings were still at the Pines Motel. The kingdom was in chaos. Parliament was screaming for their return. The press had finally broken the story, and the public was in a frenzy. But Asher managed the country from a cracked laptop on a motel desk. Declan ran the military via secure phone calls in the parking lot. Caleb managed the public relations, doing damage control from a town with one traffic light. They were holding an empire together from a roadside ditch because they refused to leave the gravity of their mate. They had changed. The arrogance had been stripped away by the sheer humiliation of their own failures. They were quieter. They were grounded. They smelled less like expensive cologne and more like pine soap, black coffee, and exhaustion. One Tuesday morning, the bell above the diner door jingled. The Kings walked in. They moved toward their usual corner booth. "Asher, Declan, Caleb." They stopped dead. Rowan was standing behind the counter. He wasn't holding a menu. He wasn't washing dishes. He was looking directly at them. It was the first time he had spoken their names out loud in 3 months. The sound of it hit the Alphas like a physical blow. Declan's hands twitched. Caleb stopped breathing. Asher swallowed dryly, taking a cautious step forward. "Yes?" Asher asked, his voice rough. Rowan pointed to a booth near the window, not the banished corner booth, a booth in the light. "Sit," Rowan said. They moved immediately. They slid into the vinyl seats, sitting shoulder to shoulder, looking up at Rowan like starving men looking at a feast. Rowan didn't bring coffee. He brought a tray with 4 glasses of water and slid into the booth opposite them. He looked at the 3 men. He saw Declan's calloused hands from chopping wood. He saw Caleb's bruised, exhausted eyes. He saw the gray at Asher's temples that hadn't been there a year ago. They were a wreck, but they were a real human wreck. "I'm not going back to the capital," Rowan said. He didn't preamble. He laid the foundation down like bricks. Asher nodded slowly. "We know. I am not the High Consort," Rowan continued, his voice steady. I am not a photo opportunity. I am not a political pawn. I live here. I work here. I like the person I am here. You are radiant here, Caleb whispered, unable to stop himself. Rowan looked at Caleb. A soft, almost imperceptible pink touched Rowan's cheeks. The mating bond, dead and dormant for so long, gave a faint, weak thrum in his chest, a spark in the ash. If, Rowan said, the word heavy and absolute. If we are going to do this, we do it on my terms. You want to be my mates? You figure out how to fit into my life. I am done shrinking to fit into yours. Declan leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. His green eyes were completely clear, stripped of the feral aggression. Tell us what to do. You split your time, Rowan said. You rule your kingdom, but you don't live in the palace. You live here. You commute. You take the train or you fly, I don't care. But when you are here, you leave the crowns at the border. In this town, in my house, you are just Asher, Declan, and Caleb. It was a logistical nightmare. Running a country from a remote mountain town half the week was political suicide. It would require tearing down centuries of protocol. It would mean exhaustion, endless travel, and constant scrutiny. Asher didn't even hesitate. Done, Asher said. Rowan blinked. He had expected a fight. He had expected Asher to try and compromise, to negotiate for weekends only, to point out the impossibility of it. Just like that? Rowan asked softly. Rowan? Asher leaned across the table, his eyes locking onto Rowan's. I would burn the capital to the ground and rule the ashes if it meant I could sleep in the same room as you tonight. Done. The air in the diner shifted. The oppressive, heavy tension that had suffocated them all for months suddenly broke, like a fever breaking. The tether deep in their chests, the ancient biological magic that bound them together, flared to life. It didn't snap into place with a violent, demanding possessiveness. It wove together slowly, cautiously. It felt warm. It felt real. Rowan let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 3 years. He reached across the table. His hand hovered over the laminate. Declan moved first. He reached out and gently covered Rowan's hand with his large, calloused palm. Caleb placed his hand over Declan's. Asher laid his hand on top. Skin met skin. A collective shuddering sigh went through all 4 of them. The physical touch, the scent of cedar, snow, and rain mixing with the sharp grounding scents of the alphas flooded their systems. The void closed. Rowan looked at the 3 men holding his hand. It wasn't a fairy tale. The trust was still fragile. The road ahead was going to be a brutal, exhausting logistical mess. There would be fights. There would be days where the scars of the palace ached. But as Rowan looked out the diner window, watching the spring sun finally break through the heavy mountain clouds, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer a bird in a gilded cage. He had the keys, and the kings were finally willing to walk out the door with him. Rowan didn't get a fairy tale, and he didn't want one. He got a life built on his own terms, with 3 men who finally learned that love isn't something you conquer. It's something you earn every single day. The Triplet kings had to leave their thrones to find their true home. If Rowan's journey from a forgotten ghost to a man who brought an empire to its knees resonated with you, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more deep, emotional Omegaverse audio dramas. See you in the next story.